About a year ago, almost exactly, I was doing a class with exercise on reconciliation, and I was working with some very bright conflict transformation students here at CMU, and the class had the opportunity to choose the topic that we would try and apply a tool of reconciliation, and they said, well, let's talk a little more about Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relationships in Canada and the conflicts there. And so we applied this tool of reconciliation, and the students were to try and figure out what's the voice of peace in this? What's the voice of justice, of truth, and of mercy? And to say, what could we do about reconciliation? And I was quite surprised by, not all, but some of the words that came out of their mouth. They were full of ignorance, of even racism. And these were my beloved peace students. And I got really angry, not at the moment, but afterwards. And as I reflected on my anger and tried to meditate on my anger, I thought, it's interesting that they're so ignorant of Canadian history, but I realized I hadn't done my job trying to teach them Canadian history. And as I thought further about this, I also realized that their ignorance is part of the intended order of violence. For violence to sustain itself, those that suffer on the margins need to be hidden from those who benefit at the center. And so I decided to teach differently, and this year we've been working through 300 years of Canadian history, of churches and of government, trying to figure out what's going on and why, and where did this come from, and why did people think this was a really good idea that we should get ourselves into this situation. And so tonight I hope we can journey in that direction, and I want to share with you just some of the insights that came along as we've been trying to study this year. Let me just remind you, reading you a short excerpt of Stephen Harper's 2008 Apology to Aboriginal People in Canada. Here's his words. Two primary objectives of the residential school system was to remove and isolate children from the influence of their families, homes, traditions, cultures, and to assimilate them to the dominant culture. And then later, today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong. It caused great harm, and it has no place in our country. And then again, there is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. I'm always surprised how wise I find these words, and I think maybe we should practice them. And that we have some distance to go in that. For us to honor the apology, we need not just more words, but more action. And not just more action, but more friendship. And tonight, I hope, is a time of cultivating that kind of friendship. Friendship with neighbors and learning how to be good treaty people. So hopefully that's what we're about. If we're going to take seriously this apology, and if we're going to take seriously trying to get rid of the violence of assimilation within our country, then we need to look where it is in all of its different forms, and all of its different sectors, and all of the different imaginations that it's taken root in. And I'm not convinced that we're doing this radically enough. The residential school was one example of a tool of assimilation, but there was a whole toolbox. The reserve system, which we're addressing more today, was another part of that assimilation system. But there were many tools, and they all seem to work together in an integrated manner to weaken Aboriginal people and to strengthen non-Aboriginal people. So it seems a bit odd that we should gather in 2014 to discuss how to be good neighbors, but this is where we're at. And to set that stage, I was thinking of the different insights that came out of the class this year that addressed global conflict, and trying to understand a little bit more, where did this come from, and why was this did people think this was a good idea? So if you look at this chart, the assimilation policies in Canada, the attitudes and the policies, that's what Stephen Harper was talking about and apologizing for. But the ripples of that, as it affects all of these different sectors, are interconnected. And it's all of those things that we need to take responsibility for. If you look up at the top of your piece and think about the education sector, here I've put pejorative terms intentionally straight out of the literature to try and say, how does these assimilative policies imagine who Aboriginal people are? And here in education, ignorant Indians is how the system was based on. And the residential school was only one really small part of that, a really significant one and a painful one. But there was lots of other attempts, industrial schools and day schools, Sunday schools. Even when the residential school ended and we went to integrated schools, the policy was still assimilation. We didn't get rid of that. We need to look at all of these different factors. If you think of the churches, including Mennonites, they sought or thought that in some cases they were saving heathens. We don't like to use that language today, and we shouldn't. But that way of thinking is deeply embedded in our theology. And so we Christians are a part of the infrastructure of assimilation. And when we partnered with the government on residential schools, that was one part of that. But again, there were other tools and other places where the same kinds of activities were happening, in church halls, in Sunday schools, in colonial theologies, just to name a few. For many of us Christians, we find this bewildering, how the Jesus who says that the greatest commandment includes loving your neighbor, how in the same name of this Jesus, all of this damage was done in the name of Christianity. We really did the opposite. In fact, we lobbied government to outlaw the sacred traditions of Aboriginal people and to make some versions of our own mandatory. We convinced government to pay us to convert and civilize them. Think about that. This is not being a good neighbor. I'm obviously highlighting negatives here, and the story is more complicated, but let me continue. The legislative systems in Canada have treated Aboriginal people as wards of the state. In 1920s already, the government had a report that called the residential school system Canada's national crime. And part of this was because it was based in bad policies, and part of it was just massive underfunding of the system, which has been a characteristic of how legislation has gone. So in that same year, 1920, when they said this is a national crime, that was the year residential schools were made mandatory in Canada. And so the whole legal system has quite often been used to criminalize being an Aboriginal person. Sylvia McAdams says there's 200 offenses in Canada that only can be charged against an Aboriginal person. Non-Aboriginal people can't be charged with them. Idle No More says currently there's 11 bills that they're fighting, current bills that still have the policies of assimilation in them. So this isn't something of the past. Bound councils were elected. Band councils were created because the Aboriginal, the traditional governance wasn't recognized or was seen as being too primitive, and so they were given a kind of a democracy on steroids, with band councils being elected sometimes every 2 years, with the government ensuring that Aboriginal people would be divided, weak, and even corrupted. The justice system, which sometimes we think we should turn to in times of harm, sees Aboriginal people mostly as criminals. Graduates from the residential schools sometimes graduate to the justice residential school, the prisons. The government reported, this is just this month, the government report in the House of Commons calls the justice system systemically discriminatory, noting that 23% of the prisons in Canada are filled with Aboriginal people, even though they make up 4% of the population. So the idea that some of these things are in the past and, we're dealing about old issues, this continues to bubble up. Natural resource management saw Aboriginal people as a hindrance to progress and to civilization. The government, and partnering with industry, wanted access to that land and the resources and the wealth, and they got it. The uninformed Canadian public is often not informed of this complex history, and of how more and more I'm coming to see that we tried to commit genocide on Aboriginal people. This violence remains hidden to them. And I think this is the purpose. Even the National last night was picking up this question on how little we are educated about what has gone on. They were looking at residential schools in the past. And so when some people don't understand the background, they see Aboriginal people as drunk or as lazy and don't want them living in their backyards and don't want urban reserves. However, this violence of assimilation is hidden from their sight, and somehow we need to be bringing it to the surface, hopefully through gatherings like this. Well, you can keep going around. The professional caregivers see Aboriginal people as sick, again, a less than human vision. We sometimes give the term residential school system, which is a gross way of blaming the victim and hiding the responsibility of the offenders and of the structures that are involved in that. When the residential school system, they tried to close it, for 50 years it took them from when they decided, the federal government, to close it to when the last school closed, 50 years. And in that time they had some reports that some reserves or some schools had a 50% death rate. Like, you actually had better odds of being in an Italian Nazi concentration camp of living than being in some of the residential schools. But still, they wouldn't return the kids to the communities because they thought the communities were neglected and more damaged than that. And so the new wave of foster care and other ways that sometimes came. So that finally gets us to residential schools, and I'm going on here because I want you to see how these things aren't separate, but we keep repeating the same errors again and again in Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations. Reserve lands were thought as a place where Aboriginal people could be forced and could be separated from each other as well as from the settler population on smaller and smaller plots of low-quality land. And where Aboriginal people once had all of this land, the treaties promised some parts of it, but so much of the promises of the treaties haven't been given back. And some have been waiting 240, 250 years for those promises to be fulfilled. At the same time that those treaties were being written, Mennonites arrived in Manitoba. And we were given two reserves, East Reserve and West Reserve. And we were given fantastic land, some of the best land in Manitoba, 500,000 acres of land for 7,000 people. And that land was given to my ancestors, and they got it within 2 years of the promise. And we took the land and benefited from the land, but in too many situations we were bad neighbors with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. So why did we get the land right away, and 240 years later, Aboriginal people are still waiting? Why did we get great land and they got marshland? I think if reserves were designed as a tool to assimilate and to separate and to exclude, is it possible that urban reserves can be the opposite of all of those? Is it possible that urban reserves could be a tool for coexistence, for togetherness, for including neighbors. If too many Canadians and Christians were poor neighbors the first time the reserve system came around, what would it look like for us to be great neighbors this time around? These are our questions for tonight. You have bios on each of the panel members. I don't want to repeat them, but I do want to thank each of you for agreeing to participate in this and for all of you to come to this. I think we do start in a deep hole. We've inherited all sorts of violence, and we need to recognize the hole and find our way out. And I'm always impressed when resilient people have the capacity to call us to both address the past and transcend it. And I think each member of this panel has been invited because I think you have a gift to offer us in that. So thank you for offering your voice from this broken hill. We'll hear first from Chief Terry Nelson. Terry, I say this with respect, but from as much as I can tell, you're a troublemaker, which most good peace builders are. Many non-Aboriginal people, I think, are afraid of you. Your gifts, I think, I was thinking about them, and the words of the poet Neil Young came to mind that I think describes you. Did he give me the gift of voice so that somebody could silence me? Did he give me the gift of vision, not knowing what I might see? A few months ago, Terry, you said that you announced a vision of wanting to see 5 urban reserves in Winnipeg within the next 2 years. And I'm curious for you to tell us whatever you want on urban reserves, and also what you think it would take for us to be good neighbors this time around.
I am Anishinaabe. I am from Roseau River, Anishinaabe First Nation in southern Manitoba. We're about 9 miles from the U.S. border. And we have lots of Mennonites in our area. So, one of them was a good friend of mine. She's deceased now. She died in a car crash not too long ago, about 3 years ago. And Marge Heinrichs was from Rosenorth. Many years ago, she had the misfortune of being chosen. Actually, they had a draw. There was 3 of them that they were reporters for the Morris Scratching River Post. And somebody had to go to Roseau River to do a story. So they drew lots. And she got a short stick. So she had to come out. And of course the reporters, she would tell me years later, but she said, we were just scared. I guess her thoughts was that this brave white woman would be found months later, ravaged, tied to a tree somewhere in Roseau River. This is one of the things that is important, is that people understand going to somewhere and recognizing that people are people. There are good people and there are bad people in every race, in every ethnic group. The Mennonite people, I was in Iraq in 1998. And one of the things that I respect about the Mennonite Central Committee was that they were in Iraq. They weren't just talking about Jesus Christ or peace or anything else like that. They were actually in Iraq with, trying to do the things that they say Jesus would have done. So I have respect for those Mennonites, not all Mennonites, but give me a break. The Mennonites who came to our area, in my language, the Ojibwe language, we had a name for the Mennonites back when they first showed up. we call German people Shawshaganisdeok. And I think you'd probably understand what that means, Shawshaganisdeok. What it means is that people with no shoes. That was the name for German people, because our people made moccasins for those people. That's how poor they were. And that's coming from an oppressed country, where their rights were not upheld. They made a decision to come to our lands. And they did well. But one of the things that some German people talk about, saying that, well, the Indians are lazy, the reservation system and all that kind of stuff. Well, I'll tell you, back in 1945, they divided Germany into East Germany and West Germany. When the Berlin Wall came down, West Germany was able to look into East Germany. Here, some of the most industrious people in the world, the German people, could not survive or could not do the same thing or under that system that we have in a reservation system, where the land is held in common, where you don't have individual ownership of houses. You don't have access as an individual to banks. And if you worked real hard in East Germany, well, you got the same pay as the person that didn't work hard. You worked for the government. And the real authority was 1,300 miles away in Moscow, or someplace like that, the same way that we see things here. The urban reserves that you talk about, people like to say economic zones, trying to placate the white people, the other people that are in there in the city of Winnipeg, saying, well, these are going to be economic zones. And I say, that's crap. These are urban reserves. These are our lands. The obligation that came out of this creation of treaty land entitlement comes from the fact that it was 1871 that these lands were supposed to be put in place. So it's not that we're impatient, nor are we militant. You would not have a people that would endure 60 to 95% unemployment the way that we have. And the only damn time that we've ever done anything even to be militant, we've had Idle No More. In January of 2013, we went to the legislature. 2,500 people joined on a very cold day. And they went and they marched on the street. Worst thing we ever did to the white man is we made him late for lunch. Because we blocked the road, the streets and everybody else, and everybody says, hey, these guys are violent. When did we bomb anybody? Have we bombed anybody? Have we done anything to make people believe that we're violent people? Nobody would endure 60 to 95% unemployment. There is currently in the province of Manitoba, 71% of the inmates in the jails are First Nation people. 71%. We make up about 14% of the population. There is over 115 murdered and missing Indigenous women in this province. There is 8,000 children in care in the child welfare system. And it's been going on since the 1960s scoop, where the province of Manitoba has full control over child welfare. And they say, they and only they have the right to be able to take these children out of our communities. And how would you feel if I came to you and said, well, I don't like you the way that you're teaching your children. You shouldn't be teaching them that Christian religion. I'm going to take them out of your home. Well, you wouldn't like that very much at all. So when they tell me that I have horns and I'm a violent person and I'm this, militant, I tell people, our people have been indoctrinated. Our people have been conditioned. And our people have been led to believe that God wants them to be poor. Well, God never meant the Anishinaabe to be poor. We were rich. These were all our lands, and nobody gave us any piece of land. And I heard one chief say during the National Day of Action, he said, when that boat hit the shore, the only land that the white man had was whatever dirt that he had between his toes. The rest was all ours. It was our land. We have shared the land. We have shared the land, and this is a great country. This is a great land. This is where you found freedom. And it is that we have signed treaties of peaceful coexistence. And treaties, very clearly, are important. Not because they gave the rights to the indigenous peoples. Because in the reservations they talk about, that wasn't given to us. Those are lands that were reserved by us for our own use. So when I put gaming on there, I bought in VLTs, we were rated by the RCMP and we were told, you cannot have this. You cannot have your own revenue. You cannot have tobacco. You cannot have anything of economic means to sustain yourself. And this is all about economics. It is about enforcing poverty. The residential school apology, as far as I'm concerned, is crap. Because it wasn't about an apology. It was about saving money. There was lawsuits in Saskatchewan where people were getting $450,000, $500,000 per person. The bean counters in Ottawa counted it all up, came up to the number of $17 billion is what they were going to, if they were going to pay it out if the courts went through. So they offered the First Nation people $2 billion. It's gone up to maybe $4 billion, but the reality is that still a hell of a lot more, less money than would have gone if they'd gone to court. So an apology costs nothing. Great words, but it's, you know, what does it mean? We still have 60 to 95% unemployment. So I think one of the things I'll stop right there, since I'm getting riled up here too. But you know, Marge Heinrichs had the biggest funeral that I've ever seen in Rosenorth. 3 full churches telecast for her funeral, and she was a great lady. So it makes me believe in Mennonites. And I do believe that, you know, your heart's in the right place, but you haven't heard from us directly, and that's why I'm here. And hopefully when you get out of this, that we are going to do urban reserves. I don't care who in the hell is in our way. We are going to get it done, because I am not about to allow our children, 8,000 of our children, to be in care, being told how they should think. And we are not going to let the 60 to 95% unemployment to continue. I was in Iraq in 1998 with the Mennonite Central Committee, and I saw what economics does. And I see Russia and the United States and people, you know, talking about economic sanctions. Well, we've lived under economic sanctions, and I tell you, that's why I was in Iraq and that's why I was in Iran. Because I will reach out to wherever I need to do to make sure that this does not continue. Miigwech.
Thank you, Terry. Deanna Zantingh, I've heard it said that in a vibrant community, the elders hold the vision of the people, but it's the youngest who are the vision. So the elders are the memory, but the youngest are the vision. And I guess that leaves those of us in between the workhorses, I'm not sure if that's true, but you are the youngest member of this panel, but I don't think that's why you have the gift of vision. I think you do have gifts of vision. And as I was thinking about you today, I think you have gifts of honoring and recovering and respecting the wisdom of the elders, while at the same time calling us to something which is not yet. And you do that in such a bold and compassionate way that I want to learn from you. So I'm looking forward to what you have to say tonight.
I think I'd just first of all like to say thank you to all of you for coming. I'm really excited that we have this gift before us that we can dialogue, and I think that's a real privilege. I want to start with a poem. It's by Robert Frost. It's called The Mending Wall. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The gaps, I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line. We set the wall between us as we go. We set the wall between us once again. To each, the boulders that have fallen to each, we wear our fingers rough handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game. One on a side, it comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Before I built a wall, I'd asked to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was likely to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down, and I'd rather he said it for himself. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well he says it again. Good fences make good neighbors. I truthfully have very little idea where to start a conversation like this one, because I'm not convinced that we can talk about urban reserves without talking about a lot of other things first, even though I think Jarem just did a good job of that. I'm not sure we can talk about the need for urban reserves without talking about the history of this nation and our place in that story that makes things like urban reserves necessary. And I'm not sure that we can understand the importance of urban reserves without knowing the context of some rural reserves and all the ways that we have not been good neighbors there. Perhaps I also find it hard to talk about urban reserves, particularly one just down the road, because it hits quite close to home for me. I was raised on a farm in southern Ontario, quite close to the heated land claims disputes of Caledonia along the Grand River Haldimand land tract. Conversation around the dinner table, on the school bus, and in groups of friends was always a derogatory discussion on what the natives were up to now. And true to the form of the character in the poem I just read, who will not go behind his father's saying, I was raised behind my culture saying that good fences, particularly around rural reserves, make good neighbors. And so, rather ironically, I find that I'm well aware of the tensions surrounding the development of urban reserves, and at the same time, that I can no longer remember why this is a big deal. And since it may actually be true that spring is the mischief in me, the story that I'd like most to share with you tonight is this one. 4 years ago, I started directing a summer camp program in the beautiful First Nations community of Mishkegogumang. This is the same small community that has come to feel like a second home to me, and that in the past 12 weeks has experienced 14 tragic deaths, the most recent of which was this morning. And so while I'm a master's student here, my best teachers, hands down, are 7, 9, 15-year-olds from Mishkegogumang First Nation. They're the best teachers because they let you into their stories, and they ask you to see the world through their eyes. The true brilliance of their pedagogy, though, is that I think they know that their story will come into conflict with your own. And just when you realize that you have grown up within a narrative that asked you to hate them or to see them as a distant other, they ask you to love them. I'm increasingly convinced that one of the most profound acts of healing, of politics, and of learning to be better neighbors is caught up in the simple act of listening. I did a lot of listening that first summer in Mishkigogamang. And if I was to tell you a story of what I learned that summer, it might go something like this. A man was going down from Reserve 63A to Reserve 63B and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, took away his land, and left him half dead. Now, by chance, a government official was going down the road, and when he saw him, he threw some money at him and passed by on the other side of the road. So likewise, a preacher came to that place and said a prayer for his soul, but left his body there, passing by on his way to the next reserve. Later, a development worker came by. Seeing the man, he tried to paint his face white, but gave up, leaving with a bag of extracted resources. Finally, a man from the hydro company came. Seeing that the man was already down and out, he took advantage of his opportunity, flooded out the man's field, forever damaging his traditional food sources, and then he too passed by on the other side of the road, his pockets lined with money. In coming to know this community and their story of deep harm and disregard, of the profound challenges and injustices that face the young people that I work with, I do not have words to express how at the same time I have experienced such a deep and humbling acceptance from them. They have welcomed me in, even though it is so often at the hands of people who look like me or who represent systems that work for my benefit. In fact, a more accurate version of the story that I just told you, which may hold some resonance around the parable of the Good Samaritan, is the one where I am the one laying half dead on the side of the road, when it is an Anishinaabe person who comes down the road, moved with pity for me as they bandage my wounds and put me in their car and take me to their house, welcoming me in until I become a more whole person, until I come to see them as family instead of enemy. Truly, I think our single greatest need is to know one another. Getting to know my Anishinaabe neighbors has made me a better version of myself. And getting to know their story, I realized that I was better able to understand my own. In fact, I can no longer look at Canada or Turtle Island in the same way. They've asked me to step out from behind my culture saying that good fences make good neighbors. I can no longer return home and look at the Six Nations land claim in the same way. Instead, I have to first look back to the year 1730, to the life of a young man named Henry Beamer, who lived on the Rhine River in the Netherlands. Henry ran away from a military service and settled in New Jersey. That is, until in his loyalty to the British Crown during the American Revolution, he fled to Canada as a United Empire loyalist. Yet, 100 years before this lad Henry ever stepped off that boat, a treaty had been made between the Dutch and the Six Nations, known as the Two-Row Wampum, wherein they agreed to live as peaceful neighbors in a relationship of friendship. Yet amidst the upheaval of the American Revolution, Native communities were separated by new borders. Their lands were taken and decreased in size. While at the same time, the family of Henry Beamer, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, was given grants from the Crown for over 900 acres of land. The story of hostility towards Six Nations people that I grew up in does not know its own story. And this is why I say that I was sick in ways that I didn't even know. Now, what does any of this have to do with Kapyong Barracks or with urban reserves? First, I think it asks us to understand our own story and to return to the wisdom of the treaties based in friendship. Secondly, I think it points to the way that economic exclusion and economic dependency have been used as weapons to weaken First Nations communities, to cut them out or to make them like us. To restore the right relationship will require more than wordy apologies, more than money, and probably even more than urban reserves. But urban reserves are a small part of contributing to a right relationship through better economic connection. They might begin to be an answer that gives birth to more answers about how we can be better neighbors. For me, the action of loving my neighbors must begin with the recognition that far too much has already been lost, and there are no clear means of restitution. It is the decision to care with the knowledge that my own well-being is caught up in theirs. It is a decision to act as a neighbor, knowing that it is a call to go beyond upholding a basic minimal standard of a legal right to land. I don't just want to see you get that land, I want to see you thrive on it. I think it asks me to respond in a manner that says, maybe I am my brother's keeper, and maybe at the heart of this crazy challenge that Jesus elicited to us is the profound tension that we'd be willing to sacrifice for our neighbors. I want to end with a story and a question. This past December, I was up in Mishkegogomang, and we had just finished a gingerbread house competition, and I'd stepped outside of a friend's house, unnoticed, to get a breath of fresh air. It was dark, and no sooner had my feet hit the snow that I found myself suddenly surrounded by 3 young Anishinaabe men. To be honest, panic and fear welled up in me, and the racist person that lives inside of me braced for the worst. When suddenly, one of them called out a familiar nickname to me, and I found myself suddenly in the midst of a group hug and a young man's story of his recent victory in drug rehab. I think the moral of the story is that sometimes what appears to instill fear in you and what is unknown may actually turn out to be one of the greatest gifts you ever receive. And that's why I want to ask you, how is it that you envision urban reserves? Is it with fear of the unknown, with a fear of the other? Or can you imagine ways that the Kapyong Barracks could represent an opportunity for us to witness and finally see the success and tremendous gifts of First Nations communities? Can it become a place of new beginning, of better connection, of enhancing and growing together? Make no mistake, friends, carving out a place for this relationship that is foundational to the future of this country, where we lay down our weapons of economic and social exclusion on the grounds of what was once a military base, this is a call to turn swords into plowshares. And I hope we do everything in our power to stoke the fires that transform violence to friendship. Thank you.
Thanks, Deanna. Chief Dennis Meeches, people may know your background as a community leader and band counselor and as a chief at Long Plains, but they might not know that he's also a gifted dancer and singer and traditionalist, and I hope you bring all of those gifts to this discussion. I was impressed that last month you had, I heard, over 250 people at the conference on urban reserves that you helped to host. And I know for you, urban reserves is not just some far out future possibility, but is both a current reality as well as a current negotiations about what's going on here. So I'm deeply glad that you've agreed to come here and welcome here, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say about urban reserves.
Thank you very much. Bonjour, my name is Dennis Meeches. I'm the chief of Long Plain. My spirit name is Strong Standing Eagle, and I'm from Long Plain First Nation. Just a few little stories before we get on to the urban reserves. It was raised by my grandparents. My grandparents went to residential school. My parents were in residential school. I just missed the residential school by a year. So I always thank God for that. Kapyong, the irony behind Kapyong, to speak a little bit about our involvement to our treaty of 1871, our people were exempt from serving in the war, any war, or enlisting. So we had really high enlistment rates into World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, even Vietnam. So a lot of our people enlisted in the service. And there's a lot of debate about that among our people because we were exempt from service, but we had the highest enlistment rate among ethnic groups in Canada. Part of the main reason for that is because our people were fighting to protect the treaty with Canada, and we felt that our ancestors felt and our veterans felt that if Canada lost the war, then we would lose the treaty that was in place. So that's a little bit of history behind that. And I have had an uncle that served in Korea.
So what I want to talk about is a little bit about the history of reserves. My own opinion, just general observations. I've been involved in politics at a young age, town hall meetings, at the reserve hall meetings. Back when I first turned 18, I went to a meeting, and there was a lively discussion about what was happening with First Nations people. So I was baptized young into politics. My grandfather was a chief. My uncles were chiefs. So I first got elected into council in 1988, up to 94. From 1998 to 2009, I was the chief of Long Plain First Nation. So I wanted to do things differently because I witnessed so much growing up on my reserve, with living in poverty, working hard, and I wanted to change things. I wanted to effect change on my First Nation. So I did a lot of things a lot different. Accountability and transparency is one of the biggest things that we introduced at Long Plain First Nation. Pretty much unmatched across the country. And I knew that government funding is not going to meet the needs of First Nations people. And we receive government funding no different than municipalities, cities. Everybody receives government funding of some sort. So the economy for me was the big thing. Any election that we have, it's always about the economy and it's about jobs. The thing about elections in First Nation communities is that there'll be election probably tomorrow someplace in Canada or in Manitoba or next week or next month. That's just the way it is. In Manitoba, we have 64 reserves. So the Indian Act, what it basically did was created a reserve system, my opinion, based upon the British and the French feudal system of governance. We're the only people in Canada that have an election system that's basically broken, because what's happening is there's a revolving door of chiefs coming and going, chiefs and councils constantly coming and going. So there's no real political stability in that form of governance. What you need, what Canada needs and what the province needs is they need political stability in First Nation governments. The reason why is because to provide that type of political stability will strengthen the First Nation communities. Because the system right now that we live under, the Indian Act Section 74, is a 2-year term, or if you're under banned custom, it's a 3-year term. So what I've been pushing for and lobbying for a long, long time is a system of governance where we have a uniform elections, at least in this province. So no different than a provincial election you would have, or a municipal election, you'd have 64 First Nation elections on the same day. Nobody really cares who's elected in Long Plain. It doesn't hit the media. It might Peguis or Rosa River. It might take a paragraph from the local paper, but that system is broken, and it hurts First Nations, it hurts Manitobans, and it hurts Canada. So that system needs to be fixed, and we need to fix it. And I've been pushing hard for a governance system that would give us a 4-year term, our own chief electoral officer, our own election code that would govern our elections, and that would strengthen Canada. I truly believe that. His election, I've served with Grand Chief Nelson for a long, long time, in the Tribal Council. He's part of the Treaty 1 group, Treaty 1 nations. His election just happened in January. It was a close election. There's 5 people that ran. My son ran for Grand Chief. I was pushing hard for him. He's a young man, part of the Idle No More movement. He didn't get in, but he is a leader. I had a real tough decision to make about who I wanted to lead, and it pretty much came down to the wire. And I had to look, and I looked at Chief Nelson, who I know. He's a visionary, a little bit rough around the edges, a little bit hard line, but that's, when you think about it, he got in, just cleared the margin, and So what that tells me, and I voted for him after my son was bounced, what tells me is that, and there is a sense of frustration, and Terry shared that with you here, and it's been ongoing for a long, long time. So there needs to be a change. Change has to happen. And Terry has put a lot of promises on the table for the chiefs, and he put himself in a really difficult position to attain a number of urban reserves in the city of Winnipeg. But Terry has done something no other chief has done, or other government leader, First Nations leader. He's managed to convert a reserve within 6 months, unheard of.
6 weeks.
6 weeks on Highway 6. And the government, what in effect happened was the government buckled under Terry's demand for whatever reason. And my thinking is on urban reserves, when you think about it, you think about the history, the historical record of First Nations, the challenges that we faced throughout the centuries, is that I'm actually, in a way, thankful that when they created the reserves, that they cheated our people out. They cheated our people out when they created our reserve in 1876. They didn't give us the full allotment of land that we should have received. Can you imagine if we would have received a full allotment of land at that time? There would be no land claim. So the shortfall, it was a pattern right across the country. The pattern of treaty land entitlement shortfalls. The surveyors, it was done by design and it was intentional. And it's been proven. So you have all these land claims across the country, and there's still, majority of them, many of them unsolved. We're slowly getting there to resolving the land claims, but it's going to take some time yet. What's happening too in the reserves, the demographics are changing at a dramatic rate. I first got elected into council in 1988, 1,200 band members, Long Plain First Nation. 2014, 4,200 band members. 3,000 band member increase in a very, very short period of time. My people, Anishinaabe people, the total population is about 1.2 million of Anishinaabe people. So wrap around the Great Lakes into the northern states, into Saskatchewan. It's a very, very large nation. My goal is, in order for Canada to come to terms with our people, is that they need to strengthen our treaties. Instead of attacking the treaty, they need to strengthen the treaty. There is a treaty in place, and I believe if they strengthen Treaty 1, work with us and strengthen the treaties, it's better for Canada. You know, the American experience is a lot different. I used to go there when I was a child. I've been traveling on the Powwow Trail since 1960. I started dancing in 1966. I'm still dancing today. And when I used to go there as a child, I felt sorry for the American Indian. I go there today. They're very, very patriotic. American Indians they wave the flag. In Canada, it's very hard to find a Canadian, a First Nation Canadian, to raise that Canadian flag and be proud to raise that. It'll be very hard to find people that'll do that. We still fly the Canadian flags, and one of the reasons why is because our veteran ceremonies, we have veteran ceremonies for our people, and our powwows, we acknowledge our veterans. Canadian flag is flown. But a lot of people, there's a lot of debate about that in First Nations country, about that symbol and what it means to First Nations people. Cap Young, I can tell you right now that I'm probably the main instigator of Cap Young. Cap Young probably wouldn't be on the table if it wasn't for Long Plain First Nation. We fought hard to get Cap Young on there because of the treaty land entitlement. The existing legislation and the treaties, through our treaty agreements, allowed us to do this. So we take advantage of it. It's no different than anyone that wants to gain an economic advantage. So we went after Cap Young. The thing about Cap Young is that the federal government introduced a policy called the Strategic Disposal Policy, on the eve of the Department of National Defense declaring that land surplus. To me, the policy was designed to keep the land out of Indian hands. So we challenged it, and here we are, 10 years later, millions of dollars later that the government has wasted, which could have been easily resolved. People are afraid of what an Indian reserve means. If you come out to Long Plain, we're not a typical Indian reserve. You have a stereotype thinking of what that might look like. Long Plain is a very beautiful community. We have an urban reserve in the city of Portage, and we bought additional land to that urban reserve. There's a little, straight off Trans-Canada, there's a little development there called Pine Crescent. The people of Pine Crescent were very afraid of, when we purchased the land, they were afraid what would happen to the land. So they asked for a 50-foot buffer zone from that piece of property. But we've been developing the Portage property for quite some time. It's part of the community. I meet with the city council every 3 months. You know, we have an municipal development services agreement with the city. Portage was a real tough town to grow up in. I believe is a redneck town growing up in Portage as a child. A lot of racism, a lot of problems, but it's changing. The face of Portage is changing. And it's going to continue to change because the reserves can't meet the demand for housing, for jobs, education, infrastructure. So they're spilling over, and you're going to see migration happen for the next 10, 20, 30 years, huge numbers coming into cities like Portage, Winnipeg, Brandon, Thompson, Dauphin. It's happening, and it's happening at a steady pace. So it only makes economic sense for us to chase our people into the cities, set up these reserves, find a way to create economic development, employment and training opportunities, get them integrated into the economic system that we have within the city, the province, and the country. It only makes economic sense. You have a strong First Nation population, strengthens the province, strengthens the country. The policies of the government are those old policies that broke the back of First Nation social order, social structure, did a number on our people, did a number on you. Indirectly, you're being affected by the government decisions of the past, but you can make the changes for the future because of what you now know and what you now are able to learn through Facebook or other means. That's how I connect with my people. I have a radio program every Thursday. I have a program called Chatting with the Chief. That's how I communicate with my people. And if you're living in Saskatchewan or Winnipeg or Ontario, you can listen online. So I communicate with them about the bread and butter issues, about the energy projects, about our relationship with the province, our relationship with the country, what we're doing at Long Plain. So we're looking at game changing, and urban reserves are a vehicle that will be a real game changer for the province and for the country. Saskatchewan is way ahead of us. They have 52 urban reserves, 52, and 55 in the queue. Here we have, Long Plain has 2. There's a few satellite reserves outside of Winnipeg, but I agree with Chief Terry Nelson. This is one vehicle. It's not the answer to end all problems and challenges that we face, but it's a good step in the right direction. It makes economic sense. So, I don't know, I think my time is up, but I have a lot to share with you, but thanks.
Thank you, Dennis. Kenton, like Terry, you get accused of being a troublemaker. That's not the only thing I like about you. You have a rare combination of being an exceptional teacher and practicing what you teach. And I know you work hard to try and create resonance with your words and your actions and your relationships and your clothes and your food. And I really admire you for that. You've been working at being a good neighbor in this space and in this land and sharing this land as it relates not to urban reserves but to food, land, and to seeds. And when I think of what are the positive stories of where good neighbors are already happening. I think the work that you're doing falls into that. So I look forward to hearing from you.
It's hard to know. Is this going?
Yeah.
It is hard to know what would be helpful to say here, and so let me tell a story or two and then talk a bit about the work that Jarem alluded to about sharing land and seeds that is happening in this place, on this land for which I have a great affection. When I'd left the house on Friday nights as a teenager, my dad would say as I went out the door, "Remember who you are." And I always wondered what he meant, and I think that was his point. When I came here to this place as a student, I was taught by my theology professors to remember who you are. And again, I wondered what they meant. And I continue to wonder what they meant, and I think that was their point. And 2 weeks ago, when I went with fellow farmers to White Earth Reservation in the United States, in Minnesota, for the Indigenous Farming Conference, Michael Dahl, one of the elders of the community and one of the most gifted storytellers that I've ever had the privilege to sit with, encouraged us in the opening and encouraged those who were gathered to remember who we are. So I think there's something there. In my family, there is a story that's told that helps me to remember who I am, that is about my grandfather, my mom's dad, Jacob Siemens. The story is set in the North Reserve in Saskatchewan, where we also received an allotment of land as Mennonites north of Saskatoon. And it happens in the 40s or 50s. And it has to do with the crusades that were coming across the prairies at that time, the tent revival meetings, which Grandpa really didn't want any part of. The story goes that the preacher came to the end of the driveway, and as was the custom, the opening words were, "Brother, are you a Christian?" And, Grandpa responded by telling him to go and check with his neighbor. That story helps me to remember who I am and reminds me that I'm not the best person to tell the story, and humbles me when I think of my neighbors reflecting that back to me, as you have here tonight. My people came to this place, to Manitoba, onto Treaty 1 land, in the late 1870s, in the first wave of settlers that came to make the prairie bloom. We were the ones that were to bring agriculture to the prairies. And we came with a document in hand called the Privilegium, ironically, that was to guarantee us space for our community, for our language, and for education, because those were important to who we were. We arrived on boats that came up the Red River, and we moved on to the East and West Reserves here in Manitoba, and my family ended up somewhere southeast of Morden and Blumenheim. The histories there are, I'm only beginning to dig into them, and it's because of the gifts of friendships that I've begun to develop with people like Carolyn Chartrand, who is here, and I'll talk a bit about her in a little bit. But those memories, those understandings of who we are as settler people, and what that moniker might mean for us as we understand that identity within the context of this bioregion, within this watershed, on this territory, is significant, I think. The reason that it's significant is because it locates us. It helps us understand that we exist in place, and that history has meaning and it has relationships that are wound up in it. I was reminded of those relationships and how they are wound up and wound together, and the importance of remembering when I was befriended by Caroline Chartrand, who describes herself as a landless Métis seed saver, at a Seedy Saturday gathering here at CMU 3-4 years ago. And we began talking not about our identities as settler Mennonite and as Métis, but about seeds and stories that are held within seeds, and about Caroline's work to gather together all of the seeds that were indigenous to this place and to the Métis people. We farm outside the back door here, not more than 50 yards, on an acre of land that was gifted to us by the university. And we were interested in saving seeds for a whole bunch of reasons. But Caroline helped to remind us that seeds also carry story. And when she first came out to the farm to help us learn what exactly it is that we were walking into in saving seeds, she narrated her participation and her coming to this land as connected into the the early 1870s, when the Mennonites arrived by riverboat. And she said, and my people met you there, and we helped you move with our Red River carts. And so this is a part of that long story of friendship. And I was completely dumbfounded with the way in which she helped me to remember who I was. A relationship with the CMU farm developed, and a friendship developed, in which we began to ask questions of the seeds that we might share in common. And there's an early scarlet horn carrot that was indigenous to the Métis people here and was used in the 1800s, that when we began to dig, found that it was likely brought over by Dutch Mennonites into the eastern coast of the United States. And we remembered that we were connected by that seed, and we grew it out together. They're now in the fridge waiting for the second year. We talked and worked together, and she taught me how to use a broad fork on the soil to get rid of the quackgrass. And we thought for a little bit about, in the context of the conversation about the Métis land claim, which is just beginning. For those of you that don't know the story, in the 1870s, the Manitoba Act and the history of Riel and the government that was here prior to Manitoba becoming a province, and the violence that occurred there. There was a promise made at that time, around the same time as Treaty 1, that was to for 1.4 million acres of land, much of what is Winnipeg right now. And we began talking about what that might mean. And she shared with me the struggle that had happened through the Manitoba courts and the final appeal process that had gone to the Supreme Court of Canada. And after having been put down and put down and put down here in the province of Manitoba, it went to decision at the Supreme Court and was unanimously decided 9-0 that in fact there was validity to this claim, which of course was no surprise to the Métis people. And so we sat there digging in the garden and growing these early scarlet horn carrots, and imagining, less than a mile from the Assiniboine River here, and the trail that we call Wellington Crescent, and how that would have been a part of a pathway that has long been traveled. I wonder if this was part of a Métis commons and settled in those long strips, much like the Mennonite villages in southern Manitoba, those long strips that we settled in. Relationships like that in places for which I have a long affection, this place and this land, are only enriched by that kind of friendship and that kind of cultivating of memory, I think. And I'm privileged to share that story with you tonight as a part of an example of what I think an urban reserve will look like. Not might look like, will look like, if we are careful and attentive and if we work. I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Kenton. Jeffrey Ansloos, you, I think, have the gift of a bumblebee.
Wow, that's a first.
Yeah, not everybody wants to have the gift of a bumblebee, but we all know from at least the bee movie that without the bee pollinating different flowers, all of life dies. And I'm fascinated how your life and your work tends to cross-pollinate all sorts of, not unconnected, but not obviously connected areas. So from indigenous worldviews to psychology, to nonviolence, to First Nation youth, to theology, to trauma, to Cree people, to Mennonite people, it seems to me the bumblebee touches difference in such a way that it makes flowers bloom all over the earth. And if I've got you right, I think this is your gift. So I've been looking forward to hear what you have to say for us today.
Thank you. That's quite an introduction. Miigwech to our members here today. Thank you to the chiefs for being with us. What an honor that is. I find it difficult to know which voice to give you tonight. Which hat do I wear? I remember as a little boy, growing up predominantly in the southern part of the city, not too far from where we are at the moment, being in classrooms and hearing as a young boy deeply racist things said about those natives in the North End. And the color of my skin let me sit in silence without being noticed, because I could pass as just white. But I sat there as a boy knowing that something didn't feel okay inside me with that story. And as a teenager, ironically enough, through church missions movements, I found myself on northern remote reserves in Manitoba, in Nunavut, and in Northwest Territories and northern Saskatchewan. And I increasingly became connected to a culture that seemed alien to me, yet was deeply alive in me. My grandmother is a survivor of residential schools in Brandon and Portage area. My mother was adopted to a Mennonite community in southern Manitoba in the 1960s. And so quite active in my personal story and narrative is this connection to the traumas of First Nations people. And yet my father is a British immigrant. And so I simultaneously hold a status card and a British passport, and go to a sweat after sitting in a church service. And I wrestle with these two very real and very beautiful cultures that are both alive and at war and making peace within me. So this is an interesting discussion to sit in and consider these questions of being a neighbor, and I ask myself, well, who am I being a neighbor to? Which voice, which part of me? And I think as I've listened to my friends here, I'm struck by the fact that part of what this question of being a neighbor rests upon is this construction of being an other. I think in my own life, I'm coming to question that difference. And I have the honor of teaching a group of students who are, many of whom are in this room right now, and I'm happy and proud to see you here. We've been spending the last few weeks discussing identity as settlers and as indigenous people. And as I teach a room full of predominantly Mennonite, second and third generation immigrants to Canada, I am struck by the fact that although many of them do not see themselves as Aboriginals, they will be grandmothers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers and grandmothers to Aboriginal children in the future, because our sheer demographic growth in population will render Manitoba, which comes from our language is in Manitoba, which is an Aboriginal word. The spirit of our people in Manitoba will be that of a mixed people, of a future that is inextricably connected and rather than assimilated, these two peoples, these neighboring peoples will become family through just the changing population of our land. And so I question these, there's lots of discussions we could have about reserves and whether or not even the construct of a reserve is helpful in understanding the future when these very words and systems come from a colonial paradigm. But I live in the North End today, and I don't see the North End as the other anymore. I find when people talk about the North End, and they don't say much more than the North End, I know what they're meaning. I know what they're talking about, the juxtaposition of the North End of the city to the South End of the city. There's a class divide, there's a racial divide. But when we start to see one another in a deeper relationship, one in which we're no longer perhaps institutionally different or corporately different, but see ourselves as intermingling in the types of relationships we describe in family, I think a discussion of exclusion becomes much more personal. And add to that, you know, our deeply ignorant cultural history, our disconnection from treaties. If I were to assess from a clinical perspective pathology, I'd have to, what's going wrong in Canada? Why is the question of neighboring even an issue here in this part of the city? I would say it's mainly contingent upon how we have constructed our own identities as other. So what are the ways that we deconstruct that? I'd ask my students who have been in my class the last few weeks, how do we do that? And I think part of it is by dislocating ourselves, finding ourselves among people that we consider strangers, and learning from one another. But I think another way that we do that is by listening, which you raised before, and I think we've heard for hundreds of years now in Canada that the relationship between our nations has to be restored. And the continued violation of that relationship, to me, is indicative of a listening problem. So in that context, how do we listen, and how does that listening propel us towards a different kind of action? I hope that action is one in which we no longer fear being Native. For me, that was one thing, to say that I was afraid to be Native in a context of little boys saying racist things when meanwhile in their midst was a friend, a brother, a family member who they loved yet didn't fully know. And so part of I think this journey is about bearing witness to who you are, which I think you raised earlier, and your family, remember who you are. And for me, I have to remember that I am both Cree, and that I carry in my family the brokenness of colonialism. I have to remember that I'm also a settler, as a child of an immigrant. I have to remember that I can't pretend not to be a Christian, despite the fact that Christians do horrendous things around the world. That would be like cutting off a part of my body. I had a dream, though, last night that made me remember I was Aboriginal. I dreamt that CMU, this campus, had a fire in the middle of it. And I walked up to the fire, a fire dream. I walked up to the fire, and at that fire was an elder that I know. And he was smudging the campus and purifying it. And I asked him, well, why? And he says, well, this place needs healing. I think for me that's where I'll end. But you know, these intersections of identity don't render us only as neighbors, but they render us as family.
So we end on all my relations.
All of them.
I knew this evening wouldn't go as I planned. I had a timekeeper at the back and saying, show them when it's 10 minutes, and then sit down and don't do anything about it, because we're going to let them speak as long as they need to speak. I also said that we wanted to end by 8:30. So I think what we'll do is that we will end, but for people that want to ask questions and for those that have the time, we will give time for conversation to happen. There's still more coffee and cookies, is that correct?
Can I make one?
Yeah.
I guess one of the things I want to make sure of is that people understand that these reservations are not going to be impoverished. The Capion Barracks requires about $300 million worth of development. It will be developed. Back in 20 years ago, in 1994, an individual, a business person, helped Rosa River. He's the same guy that helped me do the $80 million settlement on the 1903 surrender. Back in 1994, before we had TLE in Manitoba, he had worked with Miller Schroeder of Minneapolis, and he had put a business plan together. And the president of Miller Schroeder came up and met with Philman and whatnot. And the business plan was that Rosa River was going to buy the Winnipeg Jets. We were going to we're going to buy the Winnipeg Convention Center. We're actually going to build a third level on it for the hockey. Actually, all of the downtown MTS center is based on that business plan. The president of Miller Schroeder called up one day to our friend, and he said, we have sent your business plan out for a grade. It's come back with a grade. There is a grade on your business plan. You have $275 million. We haven't issued the bond, but we are in a legal position to do it. You have your money. Go make the deal. Well, we went to Philman and government and said, we have the money to buy the Winnipeg Jets. We have the money to buy the convention center. The jaws dropped. I mean, the president had come up from Miller Schroeder and met with the Philman government. But the attitude was, what do you mean Rosa River has $275 million? Well, at the end of the meeting, it was just basically, we were just kidding. We're not going to let Rosa River buy the Winnipeg Jets. But we had the money. And I'm telling you right now that we will have the money to develop these reserve lands. I'm telling you right now that I've already went looking for $30 million for a health center, a private MRI, CT scan, ultrasound, all of the other stuff that we're going to be building on one of the reservations here. It's going to be outside the city. But I didn't get my $30 million. I did get a commitment for $50 million because they are that excited about this project. Private MRI, CT scan, ultrasound, diagnostic clinic. So Brian Sinclair, who died in the health science center because nobody wanted to look after him, and we'll fix that. And I don't want our people sitting around waiting 12, 20 hours to see a doctor. Triage can do that. And we have the people to do it professionally. But also, Long Plains needs $15 million to develop, to do a bit of the project that they want. The Native Americans, I was at Native Americans at Res Conference last week. Native Americans currently are doing $28 billion per year in gross profit under casinos. Put this in context. The whole city of Winnipeg, GDP is $26 billion a year. GDP, not gross profit, GDP. So I think anybody that says that these are poor Indians, they're not going to, we're never going to get anything done. It's going to be, upside down cars and starving dogs. I mean, these are the urban reserves? No way. You want to know how the urban reserves are going to come about in the city of Winnipeg? Just take a look at Saskatoon. The mayor of Saskatoon wants to be here. He wants to come and tell Winnipeg that the relationship between First Nations and the non-Native people in the city of Saskatoon is the greatest thing that he's gone through. And just like Chief Meeches said, 52 urban reserves in Saskatchewan. Nothing to be afraid of. Mm-hmm. West Bank was here on the 26th of February. They have a GDP of $500 million. And that's in Kelowna. It's 118,000 people in Kelowna. We're 714, something maybe 740,000 in the city of Winnipeg. So we have the capability to do this, and we will do it. So I'm just telling you that get involved, learn. Thank you.
Yeah. When you were talking before, Terry, I was writing down the name of Martin Luther King's book, Why We Can't Wait, and he also reflected quite powerfully on it's often the oppressors say wait, and we've heard that strongly from you, but I think from a non-Indigenous perspective, we can't wait for the government to do the right thing anymore either. And this is a time for us to also not wait.
Well, I don't believe in nonviolence. If nonviolence just means that it's colored for colored people, and the white people decide that violence is okay for them in enforcing their rights. I don't believe in nonviolence. And I think if we require that we, like Gandhi said, he was for nonviolence, but violence, he embraced violence as a last resort. And before we get to that last resort, you should change the attitude that nonviolence is just for colored people. Thank you.
Thank you. I am sorry that I was not able to give a chance for you to ask questions in public. We will see if there's time for some discussion afterwards. When I started to plan this evening with Ovid Mercurdy, he said, Jarem, make sure you do it in the springtime, because if you do it in the wintertime, everybody will be depressed and they won't come, so you have to wait till spring. And we thought we had waited for spring, but it kind of still feels like winter. But I am grateful that you have spoken with your presence here and that we have a room full of people. So please extend our thankfulness to these panel for engaging us.